Recording. Okay. And the old collaborate, the recording button was like big and right on top, and it was really hard to remember. Forget. So for those of you watching this later, I'm very sorry. We talked about the first 3 slides a little bit, and feel free to email me for more information about those if you'd like to. So, all right, so back to our chat. Super interesting chat. I think most everyone would say, even Kirkpatrick, who's really not, he's really derisive towards religion. I once saw him just upbraid a religious student of mine at a conference, and he's a character. But if religion contributes to survival, I don't think even he would think that religion is a full spandrel, that it has no purpose. He would just say that the purposes are, could be better served maybe by other things. But most everybody sees that religion has some purpose in people's lives, that there's at least some kind of secondary gain that happens from religious affiliations and religious work, or identities, all of that. So altruism, throwing oneself on a metaphorical grenade to save others, yes, not beneficial for my survival, but it would be beneficial for my group, right? If I have kind of an altruistic, and religions promote altruism, so in that way you would get an acceptation. So spirituality, yeah, it depends on your definition of spirituality and religion, Tiana. So that's like a long conversation from module 1. So I'm not going to go down that pathway because it will not be on this quiz, but just kind of being aware that when you talk about spirituality and you talk about religion, you still walk into some very different ideas about what that means. For the most part, people think of religion as an organized set of doctrines and groups, and spirituality is more individualistic and defined by the individual person. Not always, but that's kind of a trend in that. So that's why I kind of was commenting on it as an individualistic activity. If religion is an alternative application of the grouping adaptation, then it would be considered an acceptation. Yeah. Right. So people could join rock climbing groups if they could get rock climbing groups to be as dedicated to each other as religious groups are. But there's been very few groups other than family, like kinship groups, that are as dedicated and long lasting as religious groups are. And that's all religions, most everywhere in the world. Because of the nature of the group, they kind of survive forever. So intellectual skills and acceptation. Yeah, they talk about that here as a spandrel. Well, actually, they talk about intellectual skills being an adaptation, but that it equips us for some things that are actually a spandrel. Like, because someone is really, how about this? Someone is really intelligent, they're very good at chess, right? So chess doesn't help you survive in any way, shape, form that I could think of. So the chess would be the spandrel, whereas the intelligence, and the ability to like figure out and solve problems quickly and efficiently and thought, well, that kind of intelligence would be the adaptation. So, all right, hope that helps you guys to kind of figure out the difference between those 3 things and understand them. That information's on the quiz. So massive modularity hypothesis. All right. So this is another one that I thought was a little bit complicated. And it's in your book on page 45 is one place to be looking for more about it. And of course, you have your notes from the video about it as well that you guys have taken or will take if you haven't done it yet. So functioning is complex with many mechanisms, systems, like a lot of software systems. So I taught this in class yesterday morning too for the live students, and they all just kind of stared at me, and we realized something, that the book, it talks about like a computer versus multiple software systems, and everybody just kind of was having a hard time with it until somebody said, oh, they're thinking like old computers, like really old computers could really only do like one thing, right? Like they would calculate a big math problem, right? And that they would really only run one program at a time. But modern computers, everything we've known, and anything in the last 15 or 20 years, run multiple programs at once. And so you would think of it maybe as the massive modularity hypothesis would be that there's lots of programs running at once in your brain. That's how it operates. That is really that concept is as the modern computer. Does that help people? Versus an old concept of our brain, kind of a historical one, is that we kind of are doing one thing at a time in our brain. So the incredibly interactive nature of the various areas of the brain do not support a complete modularity system. There's certainly some modularization. Yeah, there's a good bit of research on the brain that shows that our brain is kind of a little bit at war with itself often. That the different systems and portions of the brain usually work well together, but and it kind of feels like one thing, but from the inside of our skin, but that actually there's a lot of like, who wins? Is it the fear circuitry? Fear circuitry wins almost all the time. We're very good at being afraid as human beings, but then there are other, attention circuitries and emotional expression circuitries, and so there's all kinds of things kind of at war, all flying off at the same time, and which one's going to kind of win. And so massive modularity would say, like, yes, all these things are happening at once, and they have different function and typology. So yeah, that they integrate together, they modularize and they integrate. So any questions about this concept? I said, I'm teaching this class new this year. It's the first time. I haven't studied this massive modularity hypothesis in like 20 years. So it was kind of fun. Collaborative, rather than more like, people argue about that. They're kind of warlike about whether or not it is collaborative or warlike, which is really interesting in and of itself. So there's a debate in the field about that, and I don't know that that's resolved yet. And there might be some really cutting edge stuff that I'm not aware of out there, but there's still kind of some debate about how the brain actually ends up making decisions to like sit here and teach a class and do that instead of going to see Star Wars with my family tonight. Right. That's okay. I didn't really want to see Star Wars that much, but so like what systems of my brain are in charge? And then you have pathologies along the way. So yeah, pathologies, I definitely see that with clients, where the depressive kind of circuitry is fighting to take control over their whole lives, or the anxiety is very good at taking over our brains. So anyway, so focus on this, make sure you understand what massive modularity hypothesis is before you take the quiz. I think you will be glad. This is just a quote, and I'm not going to just read it for you, but I put it in there, and it just contrasts the standard social science model of the human brain as really kind of like operant conditioning, right? And that explains everything. And that's kind of like the old idea, but evolutionary psychology really does go with MMI, the massive modularity hypothesis, and it really follows that model for that. So just kind of pay attention to that paragraph on page 45, and I think you'll have the concept. Okay, another one jumping into genetics now are twin studies. And one thing that I thought students were struggling with a little bit in learning this material is that really there's kind of two sets of research. One is older, one is newer. And sometimes the older research was catching people's eye and they were not paying attention to some of the newer stuff and really understanding the twin studies. So I want to make sure that your questions are answered about this. But basically, Waller is the older study, and it did more, of course, you can only have correlational research with twin studies, really, right? Because you can't like randomly assign people to their genetics and then see what happens, right? Like there's no random assignment of biology. All you can do is really look at what naturally happens. Twin studies are the closest thing we have to closer to an experiment, but there is no true experiment with genetics. At least not yet, and I kind of hope not, because the zombie thing scares me. So, and the potential for all that, right? So, 49% was genetic, right, and 51% were these other situational and social factors and all of that. If you look on the book on page 49, they explain the Waller study in more detail there. But the more recent D'Onofrio study looked at probably a better measure of religiosity. So one of the difficulties is when you measure religiosity within a society, it depends on the society, but a lot of people, because religion is so ubiquitous, and there's so many people who are religious, you end up with a really difficult time detecting things, right? If like 90% of your population is religious in some ways or spiritual in some way, and only 10% or even true atheist perspective is only like 2% or so maybe of a population, that would be a common amount, maybe 3 or 4%, but in that range. Well, how do you look at genetic factors when everybody almost has it? It would be like, what predicts brown hair, black hair in Japan? Well, almost everybody has black hair in Japan, so everything predicts it. Right? So it's a problem with doing genetic studies on religiosity because religiosity is so ubiquitous. And the second one is how religion is measured. So what makes someone religious, right? It's a multidimensional construct. So is it church attendance? That's what the D'Onofrio study used. It's not a bad measure of religiosity if you need something quick and dirty, but is it commitment? Is it something doctrinal? Is it individual activity so that you don't discriminate against people who are individualistic, particularly as religion has changed in society? All of a sudden, if you start asking about church attendance, then you're missing all the people who eschew church but still have a lot of religious beliefs and personal spirituality on their own. So it makes for kind of a bit of a mess. So just kind of being aware about issues of definitions and measures, even when looking at twin studies in religiosity, it's murky and we don't really have a great understanding, but really do understand like the older research showed like almost a 50-50 split, but some of the newer research that's more specific on how they measure things is finding a much smaller amount of genetic prediction essentially in religiosity. So any questions about that concept or anything on there? Okay. So if you understand that concept pretty well, you should be good on that question on the quiz. This is one of the more interesting questions in general. Is there a God gene? Right? So you have things in the book and you have things in the video, both, that address the question of the God gene and kind of the book and how the book, that what's his name? The VMAT guy wrote a book on the God gene, and they kind of overstated things. But then when you got into the book a little more, you could tell. One of the things to remember about research in general, and especially you guys are doing masters in general psychology, and you're really learning research and becoming experts in doing research, is that there are kind of two ways to communicate research into the general public from a researcher. One is in the empirically supported literature, right? So taking it to a journal where there is peer review. Peer review is kind of a noxious process that I've been through many times, and I'm a reviewer and I review other people, and people are really tough on each other, right? They really question everything. They lots of revisions based on feedback from reviewers, and it makes the science more rigorous, and people know that going into it even. So I think, knowing, I'm going to have to get this by the reviewers, I better make sure everything is done real tight and just perfectly as much as I can with the resources I have. And another way, which is what the God Gene book did, is to publish a book that communicates your findings. And so when you write a book, and I've written 2 books, and I can tell you that what happens when you write a book is the editors They will send it out for review, but it's not the same process as a published research article. And it's a lot more of like, is it clearly stated? Is it, basically good, right? But there's more of a marketing purpose in any book that's written, at least in a modern book. So you get two very different ways. It's one of the reasons why your professors, when writing articles, will tell you, no, go to PsycInfo and pull the articles out from the PsycInfo search and not the books, because the books, they may be the highest quality research, but that would just be because the researcher themselves was that high quality. When you put things into journal publications, is better. So I just wanted to get that concept out for you guys. I think that's really important for all general psychology students to understand. But did everybody understand the VMAT concept? Just kind of want to check in on that and what the VMAT was, right? Yeah. So VMAT is a gene, right? And human beings, VMAT2. And there seemed to be some relationship between the VMAT and a predisposition to religiosity. It's just one gene, yeah. So, and one thing to notice too is this research that took place a while ago. So it's kind of early in genetic research, because genetic research changes like every year. It's moving so fast. And that the VMAT was not working alone. And so that's one of the things to remember. A good point, Anthony, is that, do you go by Anthony or do you go by Tony? So I know you don't get to pick your name too much. Tony, all right, awesome. So Tony, is that it's really more recent research is that that this one was pointing to is that religiosity, if there is a God gene, that it's at least polygenetic. Right? So just like I'm pretty extroverted, right? That's a trait. That's actually one of the most established human psychological traits is extroversion, introversion, right? It's one of the best traits we can measure. And it's predicted by multiple genes, right? A lot of stuff is happening. Also social environment, right? You can kind of beat my extroversion out of me if you want to and, torture me essentially, and I'll stop being extroverted. But, that's my biology, right? That I was born with. And everybody's born with that biology to be either extroverted, introverted, or in the middle, a little bit of both. But that's multiple genes. And so it's polygenetic. So if there is anything genetic going on with religiosity, then it's polygenetic. So even the VMAT only accounts for about 1% of the variance. I wondered, just as a super interesting question, if there is a God gene or set of God genes, right? What implication would this have theologically? Like, what are the implications for us as religious people? For those of us that are religious, what does that mean if you're born with a certain set of genes that would make you more prone to religion or not? That God sees each person. It's kind of an interesting question, like how responsible are we for our decisions and how, and particularly the way in which we might kind of profess faith. Yeah, that we're pre-wired for faith. That's like the really interesting question. Are we pre-wired for faith? I mean, that's almost hyper-Calvinism, right? Is like, you got the genes, and you got some of them, and you got none of them, right? Kind of, anyway, lends itself to wheat and tares parable. Maybe, yeah. Like, but that it was all set before we're even born. Isn't there a sense that it's not fair? I mean, that's the criticism of Calvinism, right? Is the level of unfairness of this. Like, if we have no choice in it, we're just born biologically to be open to faith or not. Wow, that's pretty tough. That feels like a pretty mean God, right? Environmental factors maybe would turn the biology on or off. Yeah, I mean, definitely environmental factors matter a lot, and we're going to see that in the developmental chapters coming up here. There's a lot of things that predict how much children and adolescents kind of retain the faith of the family. Then the Bible would never say choose, right? So there's got to be some choice involved in this, right? I mean, I think I don't have the answer to all this. So I'm a searcher just like you guys. But it does seem, first of all, that it's not a level playing field. And sometimes we have to like accept that, right? So even if you have someone with a very low IQ score, they don't have the same ability to be able to choose God as somebody who is normal intelligence or higher. And that's not, it's an unlevel playing field. So like, what does God do with that? You know, and religions have taught teachings about that, and how does God decide, how to respond to each human being? And I think it ends up pointing a lot to grace and how much we all really do need to have an enormous amount of grace for each other, because people have the biology that they are given. Yeah, genetic mutations that might cause people. I mean, there's even genetic mutations that seem to cause people, or unusual genetic setups that cause people to be very aggressive, to have very difficult time with judgment. Even simple ones that tons of people have, like ADHD, which runs in my family all over the place. Like a psychopath would be one. Like, how do they choose God? How people who have more harder time with have sitting still in church, right, and engaging in the way in which their religion passes it on because they have ADHD. And that might cause them to pull away from the things that would build and grow their faith. I believe it would be unfair, and they would say that God is playing favorites. I don't think he is the type of God. He gives us a choice, and let me try to prove our love to him. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know how it works, Tiana. I have a lot of questions for God about this, because there definitely are things that are not fair. Autistic people would be a really good example, Michelet. So how are they responsible? How does God decide all of that? So I don't know, but it's an interesting theological question. I know for myself, in the end, I just have to trust God that he will be gracious and loving, and that he is who the Bible says he is, and that I believe that to be actually true, and that he will be gracious with people, and understands that psychopaths and people with autism and people with ADHD even are not going to be attending church very much. Or may even have a hard time understanding the concept of God. All right, let's see, it's quarter till, so I want to make sure I cover a few more things. One is this table 3.2 on the research in cognitive science. So when you're focused, I'm not covering everything that's on the quiz, but this is one of the more difficult concepts, I think, is understanding these definitions, right? So what agency detection is, minimal counterintuitiveness, religious ritual. So those are a little bit easier, but I think the first two especially can be a little bit more difficult. So I have an example for agency detection that maybe help you remember, and that is somebody from the cognitive science of religion for CSR would say this to me. So when I was a student at VCU in graduate school, I used to teach a class when I was an advanced doctoral student. I taught an undergraduate class that met at 6 to 9 on one night a week. And so I would be going, well, all around VCU was like, at the time, and in the early 90s, was like crack houses and a lot of homeless people, and people would get robbed and that kind of stuff. So I would always pray, dear God, help me find a place to park near the building, right? So I would feel safer going to my car and not have to call security and all that kind of stuff. So I taught the class for 15 weeks, and every week I got a place to park right in front of the building every week, right? So I attribute that to God is watching out for me, right? God loves me, he likes me, and he decided to do something really nice for me, right? So that's my attribution. So someone from cognitive science of religion would say, I have anthropomorphized an event in the world and attributed agency to something in the world, like finding a parking place, through hyperactive agency detection device, meaning that everything that happens in the world is for a reason, and that there's a supernatural reason for it. So they would call that agency detection. Now, many of them would say that derisively and say, I'm kind of a stupid person or something, and then they would dismiss it. It might be more dismissing, perhaps would be the right tone. Other ones would just say, no, this is just an action for people, and that's how people operate, and maybe that's how God made us to operate. A more religious person would say. Random event or tied to some coincidence. Yeah, and I don't know. It might have been a random event or a coincidence. It might be that a lot of people were leaving the building at that time every week, and it really wasn't that unusual to find a spot. Just felt like it to me. I won't know because I don't have God's perspective to know whether that was something God did for me as a gift or whether that was something that was just random. I don't really know that there's a God out there at all, right? I have faith. That's what faith is. And I base it on real things and historical things and experiences. But the probability of such random is not random at all. Yeah. Well, I mean, people can argue. All kinds of weird things happen when you put all possibilities together. So, but I appreciate you two supporting me in my belief, and I do actually believe that was just God being nice to me for once. And God's not always nice. Very difficult things happen too, and that's how the world works. Right? Very hard life we all live sometimes. And then the other one I think is difficult here is minimal counterintuitiveness. This is the magic carpet problem, right? Someone in the other class talked about transubstantiation being a good example of minimal counterintuitiveness. So it takes something that all religions, take something that's very normal and suffuses something supernatural or unusual about it. So flying carpet, it's a normal carpet, and all of a sudden it can fly, right? So that would be kind of a mythical kind of religious perspective. But transubstantiation from a Catholic perspective would be that this is actually the substance of Christ here in the communion service. So it's not just bread and wine or crackers and juice or whatever, that it's actually the substance of Christ. And because that is novelty to the human brain, that's why religious ideas will spread very quickly. Because of that novelty, we like things that are like normal but just a little bit off. And if you change them too much, then the human brain will reject it. And if you keep it too plain, same, the human brain won't care about it. But religions take this normal thing and suffuse it with some kind of big, meaningful, energy, and that's why religions last. So a long time ago, psychologists say that people need to believe in something. Yeah, they've said that. C.S. Lewis, I think, used to talk about the God-sized hole. I think that was Lewis. So there is a conversation about that among philosophers, too, about do we have a God-sized hole and we're trying to fill it. That's a whole other good conversation to have. We need more time. All right, a couple more things to cover with you guys. The video is the only place that I could see anything about the genetic fallacies, and I actually looked through quite a few of the notes for Module 2 that people have been turning in, and I don't see this in there very much. So I want to make sure that everybody got a chance to get this idea and that you don't miss it. So the genetic fallacy is that the source of information informs the veracity of it. So wherever you're getting the information from, so the genetic, the source, right, of it, helps us decide whether or not it's true. So in psychic religion, people who are from a place believe in a certain religion, or the person or source of the teaching in religion is the basis of whether or not it's true instead of the actual truth claims of it. I have a couple of links here, and don't worry, yes, because I'm the professor, so I'm the source, right? And actually, that's not a great, an authority figure is not a horrible way to decide that something is true, but you should probably use more than just an authority. I could be leading you terribly astray. You would never know, right? So, you should check out what I have to say and make sure that I haven't said something wrong, that different than the textbook, which is probably better, researched, or Dr. Hathaway, who prepared his lectures there. So yeah, you guys can do this, but I also put these links do exist in Blackboard in Module 2 at the very bottom. Yesterday, I found these links and some more things too, for a couple things that I thought, I don't know that these are really clear for people, and I want to make sure everybody feels clear about the concept. So if you want to watch a little video that explains genetic fallacy or read this blog spot, that maybe just if you need a little more. So, and then the last thing I wanted to cover really in terms of, bigger kind of concepts from Module 2 is the Good Friday experiment and the John Hopkins experiment, and really making sure that people kind of put those things together from the video, from the reading. So Timothy Leary, I mean, just one of the most interesting, bizarre people in history of psychology, but professor at Harvard, and did the Good Friday experiment with some seminarians. And there's some issues with the science of it. It didn't have great lab controls, for instance. It seemed to be kind of a bunch of his friends or people he just kind of found by snowball. And they tested hallucinogens on seminarians, so they gave them mushrooms. And so half of them got the psychedelic and half of them got a vitamin of some sort that can have some effects on your body a little bit, but not the same as a psychedelic. And then they interviewed them about the experience of the Good Friday service that they had attended. And the experimental group had higher levels of kind of mystical experiences. They felt like God was speaking to them, that God was with them, all that kind of stuff. And then they persisted in that belief for years and years and years to come. So yeah, question. I didn't understand the purpose of the experiment. Of course, the drug people will see it differently. Okay. So essentially what they're trying to show, like the point of these experiments is that biology can affect religious experience, right? That our religious experience is rooted in biology. So if you change your biology, right, then if you can change your biology, you can change your religious beliefs even and your religious experiences. This is challenging, I think, for most Christians and religious people to kind of make sense of this, right? So again, it's like, well, is there a genetic contribution to how religious I am? Well, what if I have something going on in my brain chemically that causes me to feel this kind of mystical experience? And so I think you just have to like face up to it. Like we live, whether you say, well, this is part of the fallen world that we live in, why this happens, or I don't know how you interpret this and make sense of it theologically. But it's interesting that now the 2006 study was really a replication. So they did do a replication of it, and just, not even 10 years ago, or just over 10 years ago at John Hopkins. And they did basically the same thing, except they gave them Ritalin as the control and then hallucinogen as the experimental group. And they got very similar results. People were genuinely believing that they had had an experience with God, even though only the people who took drugs had the experience with God. And the people who took the Ritalin did not have an experience with God. So this really does have interesting implications psychologically, theologically. And I think I just encourage you guys to kind of wrestle with it. I mean, one of the reasons you go to graduate school is to take on the really tough nuts of problems and try to make sense of them. I don't have an answer to this. I don't have like it all wrapped up in a nice bow. But biology affects our experience of religion, definitely, including drugs. So, if we really want everyone to feel closer to God, apparently we should give them all mushrooms. I don't know what that means, but anyway, let's see. Means if you have any types of disorders, you can see religion differently. Oh, that happens like constantly. You can think if you're in a very severe depressive state, then it's very difficult to get out of the house. It's difficult to connect with other people. It's difficult to concentrate. What prayer requires or meditation requires concentration. It's tends to be self-condemning thoughts. And I just had a client today that we had these conversations about being self-condemning, putting themselves down, feeling like an outcast. So God doesn't love me. Not really. Like I know that teaching, right? I know that there's biblical teaching, but emotionally I don't feel that way. That was in the book too. They talked about the cognitive dissonance and kind of emotional experience of God a little bit. So you have this kind of, I emotionally don't feel connected to God, right? But cognitively, like I know what my religion teaches is that God is connected to me, or that, the Spirit is connected to me, or Jesus loves me, or all those kinds of more positive kinds of belief systems, but they can't connect with it. And that has real implications for people's true, real spiritual lives. And I think I think religious groups underestimate how many people in the world are distant from their religious community because of issues, so many issues that can cause people to have a difficult time joining a religious group, and being a part of that. So, see, Joshua's question: could it be tied to a loss of ego? Yeah, maybe the drugs. So, like a loss of self-focus, being on the drug, and that causes people to not be self-focused, and then that causes them to be more open. And I mean, like, one of the theological questions is, did they actually have a mystical experience with God, right? Like, because they were, on the mushrooms, or was it just the drugs? And like, what was God doing in them in those moments, right? Where was God? That's kind of an interesting theological question. I have no answer to whatsoever, but I like asking hard questions. So. But the world is an unfair place and a sinful, fallen place sometimes, and so how you interpret all of this is I hope that it causes you to really begin to question for yourself, even like what you've believed, and to have a deeper, more rich understanding of your own faith, and a more rich and deeper, wise understanding of faith and psychology integrated with each other, so that you're not, like James says, just a boat on the wind, on the waves, tossed to and fro by the wind. But that you can answer these questions when someone comes up to you and says, hey, people have mystical experiences just from taking mushrooms. There's no real God. So think that through a little bit more. All right. Finally, I just have two things I'm not going to cover, but I want to make sure to encourage you before the quiz that you might want to look into the role of the temporal lobe. So like a piece of the brain, this is kind of the God spot question. Is there a God spot in the brain? What is the role of the temporal lobe in religious experiences? And then the lateralization studies. So I'm not going to cover that, I know we're out of time and we wouldn't have time for it, but I just wanted to point that out. And I did the same thing with my in-person class and gave them the same stuff. So you're all on an even playing field now. So any final questions? It's almost 8 o'clock. So if you need to go, I understand, and I really appreciate you being here tonight. And if you have any questions about any of this material or anything about your paper or anything like that, I'll stick around for a little bit and people can either talk or chat with me about that. Thanks for coming to class. Good night, everybody. Easter Bunny service. Yeah, that might be true with mushrooms. I had a pretty boring childhood and adolescence, so I didn't have a lot of experience with drugs. But from everything I've read, the mushrooms would make everything feel pretty mystical. They make the rug that they're staring at feel mystical for people. So it's pretty funny. Hey, it's a whole nother, philosophy of life, and America's all about freedom of choice. So, uh, good night, Tiana. Thanks for coming. Okay, looks like everybody's on their way out. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop the class.